I want you to imagine sitting quietly in your own living room, knowing your husband thinks you're 300 miles away, and watching him walk through the front door with the woman he's been sleeping with behind your back. My name is Rebecca Marsh, and that afternoon is the reason my entire marriage ended in less than 20 minutes. Because my husband, Daniel Marsh, didn't just cheat on me. He did it for almost a year, while looking me in the eye every single night and telling me he loved me. What he didn't know was that I had found out 6 months earlier, and instead of confronting him right away, I decided to wait, to watch, and to plan exactly how the truth would come out, on my terms, not his. Stay with me till the end, because this story is not just about betrayal. It's about what a quiet, patient woman is capable of when she finally decides enough is enough. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming amazing videos. My name is Rebecca Marsh. I am 44 years old, and for 18 years I was married to a man named Daniel. When people asked me about my marriage, I used to tell them it was steady. Not exciting, not dramatic, just steady. The kind of marriage you build slowly out of shared mortgages and sleepless nights with newborns and 1,000 small routines that stop feeling like choices and start feeling like who you are. I loved my husband. I loved the life we built. And for most of those 18 years, I never once imagined I would end up sitting in my own living room, waiting calmly for him to walk through the door with another woman. We met in our mid-20s, at a mutual friend's wedding, back when neither of us had a single gray hair, and every plan we made for the future still felt wide open. Daniel was funny back then, the kind of funny that made a room lean toward him without trying. He proposed 2 years later on a beach we couldn't really afford to be at, and I said yes without a second of hesitation, because I believed, completely, that I had found the person I was supposed to build a life with. For a long time, I was right. We had our son first, then our daughter 3 years later, and the version of our life in those early years was chaotic in the way young families are chaotic, but it was also full, in a way that felt permanent. I noticed the change in him slowly, the way you notice a season shifting before you can name the exact day it happened. It started small. He began working later than usual, a few nights a week at first, then more. He started taking his phone into the bathroom with him, into the garage, out to the mailbox, places he never used to bother taking it before. He became distracted at dinner, quick to snap over small things, quick to apologize afterward in a way that felt more like guilt than affection. I told myself it was stress from work. I told myself it was just a phase, the kind every long marriage goes through eventually, a rough patch you're supposed to push through quietly and come out the other side of. I wanted so badly to believe that, because the alternative felt unbearable. Looking back now, I can see all the small signs I talked myself out of noticing at the time. The way he'd angle his phone away from me at the dinner table, the way certain work trips started requiring an overnight stay when they never had before, the way he'd come home smelling faintly of a cologne he didn't own, and I'd convince myself it was just the recycled air on an airplane or the hotel's laundry detergent, anything other than the obvious explanation sitting right in front of me. I think, in hindsight, some part of me already knew, long before I let myself know consciously. I just wasn't ready to carry the weight of that knowledge yet. The truth found me on an ordinary Tuesday night. Daniel was asleep beside me, and his phone lit up on the nightstand with a message notification. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be honest about that. I simply glanced over out of habit, the way you glance at a clock, and the name on the screen was one I didn't recognize. Vanessa. The preview line underneath it was short, but it was enough. It was more than enough. I lay there in the dark next to my sleeping husband for almost an hour before I got up, went downstairs, and sat alone in the kitchen until the sun came up. I remember that morning in strange, specific detail, the kind of detail your mind holds onto during moments that split your life into a before and an after. The hum of the refrigerator. The particular gray of the sky just before sunrise, the way I kept turning my coffee mug in slow circles on the table, without ever actually drinking from it. I remember thinking, very clearly, that I had two choices in front of me. I could walk upstairs right then, wake him up, and demand an explanation before I had any real proof beyond a single name on a phone screen. Or I could wait and find out exactly what I was actually dealing with before I let it change the entire direction of my life. I found the rest over the following days, carefully, quietly, piece by piece. A hotel receipt, tucked into a jacket pocket, from a city he told me he had never visited for work. A pattern of late nights that didn't match the hours on his actual work calendar, which I had access to through a shared family account we'd set up years earlier for scheduling. Message previews that kept lighting up his phone screen at hours when he claimed to be in meetings. None of it was hard to find once I started looking. He wasn't careful. I think, somewhere deep down, he didn't think he needed to be, because he had never once considered that I might notice, or that I might have the patience to look closely enough to find it. I want to explain why I didn't confront him the moment I found out, because I know it's the question most people ask first. Part of it was fear, if I'm honest. Fear of blowing up 18 years of my life based on a handful of messages I hadn't fully understood yet. Fear of what it would mean for our kids, for our home, for every plan we'd made together that suddenly felt uncertain. But a bigger part of it was something else entirely. I wanted the truth, the whole truth, not fragments of it. I had watched other women in my life confront their husbands too early, only to be met with denials, half-truths, and manipulation that left them doubting what they had already seen with their own eyes. I refused to let that happen to me. I decided I would wait, watch, and gather everything I needed so that when the moment finally came, there would be nothing left for him to twist or deny. For 6 months, I lived a version of my life that felt like standing perfectly still while the ground moved beneath me. I kept making dinner. I kept folding his laundry. I kept kissing him goodnight, even as every part of me was screaming to do something else entirely. There were nights I sat across from him at the dinner table, listening to him describe a fictional business meeting in perfect, casual detail, and I had to focus every ounce of my energy on keeping my face neutral, on nodding at the right moments, on not letting a single crack show through. It was, without question, the hardest performance I have ever given, but I told myself every single day that I was doing it for a reason. I needed proof strong enough that when this finally ended, there would be no confusion, no gaslighting, no chance for him to convince me or anyone else that I had misunderstood. During those 6 months, I also learned more about Vanessa than I think either of them ever realized. I learned her full name from an email confirmation for a dinner reservation. I learned where she worked from a tagged photo I found through a mutual connection online. I never reached out to her, never confronted her, never did anything that would tip either of them off that I already knew. I simply gathered information the way you'd gather evidence for a case you were building slowly and carefully, because I understood, even then, that the day I finally spoke up, I wanted to be standing on solid ground, not guesswork. There were moments during those 6 months when I nearly broke. I remember one night in particular, a few weeks after I first found out, when Daniel came home late again with another explanation I already knew was false, and I stood in the kitchen after he'd gone up to bed, gripping the edge of the counter, fighting the urge to scream every truth I knew straight up the stairs at him. I didn't, I told myself. Not yet. Not until I have everything. Not until there's nothing left for him to hide behind. That single decision, to wait just a little longer, over and over again, for 6 straight months, is still one of the hardest things I have ever done. The opportunity I had been waiting for came on a Friday. I told Daniel I was taking our 2 kids to visit my sister, 2 states away for a long weekend. I said it casually over breakfast, the same way I said everything else those days, careful not to let anything in my voice give away how much thought had actually gone into that single sentence. What he didn't know was that my sister had agreed, weeks earlier, to cover for me if he ever called to check. My real plan was simple. I dropped the kids off with a close friend for the weekend, checked into a hotel less than 15 minutes from our own house, and waited. I won't pretend those 2 days were easy. I sat in that hotel room replaying 18 years of my life, wondering how much of it had been real, and how much of it had simply been me not paying close enough attention. I thought about our wedding day, about holding each of our children for the first time, about the version of Daniel I fell in love with, and I tried to reconcile that man with the one who had spent the last year lying to my face without any visible guilt. Somewhere in that waiting, my fear started turning into something steadier. I stopped asking myself whether I was doing the right thing, and I started preparing for what would come next, regardless of what I found. I drove back to the house Friday afternoon, let myself in quietly, and sat down on the living room couch with a cup of tea, the same way I might on any other ordinary day. I didn't know for certain that Daniel would bring her there. Some small, stubborn part of me almost hoped he wouldn't, that some shred of respect for our home would stop him. But deep down, I already knew the answer, because a man who lies for 6 months rarely stops simply because the house happens to be empty. I heard the front door around 4 in the afternoon. I heard his key in the lock, heard him say something light and reassuring to someone beside him, and then I watched the door swing open. He stepped inside first, exactly the way he always did, without a second thought, and froze the moment he saw me sitting there. Behind him, in the doorway, stood a woman I had never met in person, but recognized instantly. Vanessa. She was younger than me, dressed carefully, holding her purse against her chest like it might somehow shield her from what was happening. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I had already done all of my crying, alone, over the previous 6 months, and there was nothing left in that moment except a strange, steady calm. I looked at Daniel first, then let my eyes move to Vanessa, and I smiled, not because anything about the situation was funny, but because after 6 months of carrying this alone, I finally had exactly what I needed, the truth, standing right in front of me in broad daylight. I stood up slowly, smoothed the front of my shirt, and walked toward them. I introduced myself to Vanessa directly, calmly, the way you'd introduce yourself to anyone, and told her I'd heard quite a lot about her over the last 6 months. I watched her face go pale as she began to understand that this was not the first time I had learned her name, that I had known about her for far longer than either of them had ever imagined. Daniel grabbed my arm, started stammering out the beginning of an explanation, but I gently pulled away and asked him to sit down, because there were some things I needed to say, and I needed him to actually listen for once. He sat, almost automatically, the way people do when the person speaking to them has a certainty they've never heard before. Vanessa stayed near the door, clearly unsure whether she should leave or stay, her eyes moving between the two of us. I told Vanessa first that I wasn't angry with her, not really, because she had never made any promises to me. Daniel was the one who had stood in front of our families 18 years earlier and vowed to be faithful. Daniel was the one who broke that vow, night after night, month after month, all while coming home and pretending nothing had changed. I asked her one simple question. I asked if she had known, from the beginning, that he was married. She hesitated, then admitted that yes, she had known, but that he had convinced her our marriage was already essentially over. I told her I understood that she had only ever known the story he chose to tell her, and that I didn't hold her responsible for believing it. Then I turned to Daniel, and for the first time in 6 months, I let him see exactly how much this had cost me. I told him I had known for half a year. I told him about the hotel receipt, the messages, the late nights that never matched his calendar. I told him that instead of confronting him the moment I found out, I chose to wait, because I wanted to see whether some part of him still had enough respect for our marriage to end it honestly. I told him that watching him choose, week after week, to keep lying to my face instead, told me everything I needed to know about who he had become. I explained that this weekend trip had never been about visiting my sister. I told him I had spent the last 2 nights in a hotel, 15 minutes from our house, waiting to see exactly what he would do with an empty home and the freedom he thought he'd been given. I told him I needed to see it with my own eyes, needed proof beyond a doubt, before I could let go of any lingering hope that I had somehow gotten this wrong. I asked him to pack a bag and leave that same night. Not after a long conversation, not after he'd had time to explain himself. That night, I told him our kids would be told the truth eventually, gently, carefully, with the help of a therapist if needed, but that they did not need to walk into what was happening in that living room. I told him I had already spoken quietly to a lawyer weeks earlier, just in case this exact moment ever came, and that I would be filing for divorce the following week, regardless of anything he said between now and then. Vanessa left first. She offered a quiet, mostly wordless apology, mostly directed at me, before slipping out the door. Whatever existed between her and my husband seemed to dissolve the moment it was dragged out into daylight, the way certain things only survive in secrecy and cannot withstand being seen clearly by everyone involved. Daniel packed a bag that night, exactly the way I asked him to. I didn't watch him do it. I sat downstairs in the kitchen instead, and I called my sister, calm and steady, and told her that everything had happened exactly the way I thought it would. There was a strange relief in saying it out loud to someone who already knew the full story, someone who had been helping me carry this secret for months. She asked me how I was really doing, underneath the calm voice, and I remember telling her honestly that I didn't fully know yet, that the numbness would probably wear off eventually, and that I was choosing not to rush it. The weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life, but they were also, in a strange way, the first weeks in a long time where I didn't feel like I was performing. I no longer had to pretend everything was fine at dinner. I no longer had to nod along to explanations I knew were false. There was an exhausting kind of freedom in finally being able to feel exactly what I felt, without having to hide it from the one person who used to know me best. The divorce moved forward quickly and quietly, because I had already done my grieving in private, months before Daniel ever knew I was aware of the affair. I didn't fight over every detail out of spite. I asked for what was fair, for our kids' sake more than my own, and Daniel, to his credit, didn't argue much, because I think some part of him understood he had no right to. There were a few necessary conversations with lawyers to finalize things properly, but I kept my focus on making sure the process stayed as calm and uncomplicated as possible for our children, rather than letting it turn into a prolonged fight. Telling our kids was, without question, the hardest part of the entire process. I sat down with both of them together, in the same living room where everything had come apart, and told them as gently and honestly as I could that their father and I were separating, and that it was because of choices he had made, not anything either of them had done. My son, who was 16 at the time, went quiet in a way that worried me more than if he had yelled. My daughter, 14, asked question after question, wanting to understand every piece of it, and I answered as many as I could without making her carry more than a 14-year-old should have to carry. Rebuilding my relationship with our kids took time. They were old enough to understand what had happened, and old enough to be angry about it in ways that no explanation could fix quickly. My daughter asked me once, very simply, how long I had known, and I told her the truth, that I had known for 6 months before that day. She was quiet for a long time after that, and then she told me she was proud of me for handling it the way I did, calmly, without letting it destroy who I was in front of them. That single sentence from her meant more to me than almost anything else that came out of that entire year. My son took longer to come around. For a while, he split his anger evenly between both of us, as if the marriage falling apart was simply something that had happened to him, rather than something caused by a specific choice his father made. It took several months, and a handful of honest, difficult conversations, before he started directing his anger where it actually belonged. I never pushed him to see it a certain way. I simply stayed steady, kept showing up, kept answering his questions honestly whenever he was ready to ask them, and slowly, he found his own way to understanding what had actually happened. I went through a long stretch, in the months after the divorce was finalized, where I questioned almost everything about the 18 years that came before that Friday afternoon. I wondered how much of our marriage had been genuine, and how much of it, in hindsight, had been me working harder to hold things together than he ever had. I spent time in therapy, more than I expected to need, working through not just the betrayal itself, but the strange grief of losing a version of my own life I thought I understood completely. Slowly, over time, that grief turned into something steadier, something closer to clarity than sadness. Daniel and I are not friends today, but we are civil, mostly for our kids' sake. We manage school events and holidays with a kind of practiced, careful distance, enough cooperation to keep our children's lives stable, without pretending we are something we're not to each other anymore. Looking back, I understand now that those 6 months of silence were never about weakness. They were about a woman refusing to make a life-altering decision based on fragments of information, choosing instead to gather the full truth before acting on it. I wanted certainty, not assumptions, and when I finally had it, I acted with more composure than I ever thought I was capable of in that moment. I think about that Friday afternoon often, the moment my husband walked through our front door, completely certain the house was empty, only to find the one person who knew him best, sitting there waiting, calm and composed, already at peace with an ending he hadn't seen coming. People sometimes ask me if I regret waiting those 6 months, instead of confronting him the moment I found the first message. I tell them no, without hesitation, because that patience wasn't weakness. It was the only thing that let me walk out of that marriage with my dignity fully intact, and with a truth so complete that no one, not even Daniel, could ever convince me I had imagined it. If there's an